Good morning, guys, and welcome to the podcast. We're live from Houston, Texas, and I've got a fantastic guest for you today, Evan Harris. And he's a neighbor we're in the same city, and he is the president of Pathos Consulting Group. It's a tailored AI and automation solutions for independent schools. He is a AI education facilitator, and he's got a lot of interesting ideas around this new technology and what he does with his clients and how it impacts education and our school system. I'm really excited about the conversation. So, Evan, welcome.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So good to be with you, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, briefly introduce yourself, and we'll dive right into the conversation.
Yeah, I was an English teacher and administrator for about 10 years at a couple of different independent schools, primarily in the Southwest. Got my master's degree from Columbia University in private school leadership, which is typically a program you get into if you want to become like a head of school. But starting a couple of years ago, I just saw the writing on the wall with regards to what was coming at us on the ed tech side, the AI side. Basically quit my job as a teacher and administrator and went back to school again, this time to Stanford. They've got this incredible program called the Human-Centered AI program. And so a lot of the work that I do consulting with independent schools is at this nexus of organizational development, change leadership, thinking about kind of school strategy. What does this look like from a leadership perspective? And then also what does this look like from a tech perspective, particularly in regards to like data privacy, media literacy, the risk management side of bringing this kind of tech into schools.
Interesting. And
Yeah.
I know this is a Episcopal High School. It's a really famous private school down here, and really interesting. So we'll dive into the questions. One question is, so just this and you're very prescient is, or you saw this oncoming technology and you're like, oh, the shit's gonna hit the fan. I gotta do something. Very similar to, I saw this thing in healthcare. It was just like end of healthcare, that type of, what are your basically overall arching thoughts on this new technology and how it's going to impact education?
Yeah. So, no, it's a perfect place to start. I was an English teacher, and 2 years ago, the group of people who were the loudest, the most panicky, the most, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, were probably English teachers. And some of that was warranted and some of it probably wasn't. The problem really, I think, at the heart of a lot of this is that we have refused for decades now to rethink what authentic assessment looks like. We've known from people who do learning science and brain science and like a lot of research to back this up, that there are these kind of core pillars for how you can assess learning. But the problem is that we were very attached to an old model of assessment, which was like tests that rely on recall, 5-paragraph essays with no ability to iterate. You're not asking the kids to reflect metacognitively. You're not giving feedback that's formative, meaning kids can use the feedback to adjust their future performance. We're not giving kids much agency in terms of the type of real world problems they're solving, the parts of themselves they want to express. We weren't doing anything with design thinking or project-based learning. Here and there, we were doing it, but it's hard. And frankly, teachers were assessed a certain way when we were in school, and we're now repeating a lot of this stuff. AI came along and kicked us in the butt because the problem is for teachers, AI is very good at replicating student work if we think of student work as a product and not a process. AI can't do real world application or collaborative learning, like all those kind of like things that actually drive learning outcomes. AI is actually not that good at that stuff. So teachers are now forced into this position where they have to rethink assessment. The academic integrity side is meaningful. Like where are we okay with this technology being used and where are we not? What constitutes cheating? That's an important conversation. Important to note, cheating hasn't increased in the last 2 years. Kids who were using SparkNotes 2 years ago are using a new technology now. Cheating is not up overall. The last thing I'll say that I think is really important is that because we spent so much time thinking about the English classroom and cheating and all these kinds of things, I think we missed the more interesting conversation, which is about what can AI do to automate repetitive, mundane, time-consuming labor, especially on the staff side of the school. Because we were so focused on, oh my gosh, is every kid going to get their AI tutor? Is our teachers going to be replaced? Some of this kind of very sensationalized stuff. We've missed what I think is the way bigger opportunity, which is on the staff side, not necessarily the faculty side of schools.
Yeah. Fascinating. And that actually opens up so many avenues of questioning. And what I've really found interesting is just my journey as an entrepreneur is like, government and organizations, they evolve very slowly, if at all. And so it's like what you were talking about, this like very static and just one size fits all into, whereas we now live in a very dynamic and very rapidly changing in real time. So I know a lot of people, they're fed up with, they're like, yeah, this school system doesn't teach my kid anything and it's not preparing. And there's like competing countries and there's smarter kids. And so I know people that they took them out of the school system and they travel together and they learn and they want to teach them how to become entrepreneurs or how to use social media or kind of these things. So what are your thoughts on education in general? Or one is people aren't having as much kid these days, but are the institutions like Harvard and these places, are they going to die or what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think, unfortunately, because this has been studied, they've looked at countries like Finland and South Korea. They're looking at what are those levers we can push and pull on that actually drive educational outcomes for a given country. And there's certain things that we think are really effective that turn out to not be super effective. So, for example, Luxembourg has this really great student to teacher ratio. It's like 1 to 5. And if you ask parents who send their kids to private schools, they say, oh, that's one of the main reasons is you get these really small class sizes. It turns out like South Korea, way bigger class sizes, way better outcomes. So the learning science on this suggests that until you hit about 20 kids in a classroom, you're not going to see any deterioration in outcomes. What actually really is like the main driver is the quality of the teacher. And so how do you get really high quality teachers? It's actually not that surprising. You got to pay them more. And we've got to, I think, shift the way we talk about teaching in this country because we have some really pernicious ideas like those who can't do teach, like these kind of maxims we've been hearing for years. And the fact is you've got to make teaching the kind of career that people choose to be a teacher instead of a doctor or a lawyer because we hold it up in our society with the same kind of sense of honor and reverence and respect. And teachers don't get a lot of respect at the moment. So I think a lot of it has to be, that's a hard problem to solve in terms of a cultural shift, but that's what it's going to take is we've got to pay teachers more and respect them a lot more. And that's going to take time.
In kind of a parallel question to that is, it used to be like when I'm a kind of a early Gen Xer, and it used to be like schools like UT used to be like backup schools, and we aimed for the Rice and Stanford and MIT. Those were like and now it's actually hard to get into UT. Like my niece is like it's actually very competitive to get into these like California public, Texas public. It's like super hard. And so this inequality, and what I've seen is like this, like the rich can afford Ivy Leagues. And so is AI going to democratize this? Is going to be, if you have AI, it's like being a millionaire, you can send your kids, you get that educational advantage. What are your thoughts?
That's such a good question. Yeah. Like, how do we apply an equity lens to this? What does that look like in that respect? So I would say a couple of things. So the first is if schools neglect to teach AI competencies and AI safety and all these pieces directly to their students, what's going to end up happening? Certain students are going to go home to parents that are using these tools at work, and they're going to get that education anyway. And we're going to exacerbate the divides that we saw inflamed during COVID, for example, where certain went home and had to go to Burger King to use the Wi-Fi to learn. So there is like this gap that we can either now close or exacerbate depending on how we treat this. So I think it's really important that every kid get this kind of like baseline of AI knowledge. The other place where I think the equity lens is interesting is this AI tutor conversation. So for example, if you have like a school age kid right now, there's a decent chance they've heard of this thing called Khan Academy is like really famous. They've got this bot called the Khanmigo bot. And it's an AI tutor that sort of guides you through a process of learning. If you are in a sort of a position of privilege, you might look at an AI bot and say, no, this is actually not the direction education should head because the deficits kids have coming out of COVID are like social emotional deficits. And they really actually need relationships and collaboration and a human touch. They don't need to be in their own little tech silo. However, if you're a student that's not in a position of privilege, or maybe not even in the United States, but in a developing country, having a bot like the Khanmigo bot could change your life. So I think we have to be careful in casting too general of a sort of judgment about how effective an AI tutor can be, because the position you're in really dictates what could this mean for your life.
Yeah, it's really because AI is going to be a tool, and if you know how to use these tools, and it was like in the early, if you knew how to build websites, or if you knew how to utilize search or drive traffic, if you knew how to use social media, you can create great things. And so it's this new tool that people are, and I think it's going to really change a lot of things, which brings me to my next question is a lot of schools see AI as like this. "Oh, if you use AI, if you use ChatGPT, oh, you're cheating. And then whereas like in the real world, people are using AI. Like, why is the school system viewing AI as a threat? In my day and age, if you had a calculator, you were cheating. But I'm like, what are your thoughts?
Yes, I'm happy to report, and I think this is broadly true across public, charter, or private, that schools have largely moved away from the kind of knee-jerk reaction that they had 2 years ago and have moved more toward a sense of, okay, what does it mean to use this ethically? How do we use it as a tool? Like, how do we think about integrating it in a way that's thoughtful? And so what most schools, at least the schools I've worked with, are moving toward is something called the traffic light model, which is essentially a green light, yellow light, red light. And it's three categories of assessments where you can use AI tools in any way in which you feel comfortable. And that's interesting language because a lot of students actually don't love the idea of giving up part of their voice to an AI and collaborating with this thing. So there's still some discomfort on the student side. It's not all like 100 miles an hour from the kids. The yellow light, really interesting because that's where we get into process, like artifacts of your learning, citation of your process, like AI for certain steps and not for others. That's where like the really interesting work is happening, is like what parts of the process are we willing to say, no, this is just drudgery. There's no benefit here to saying an AI, you have to do this like by hand. No, an AI can do this part. But we want to be really careful about how we cite that and how we create artifacts to document process. This is what I was alluding to in the beginning. And then there are still those red light assignments where we say, no, AI is absolutely not going to be involved with this at all at any level because we see so much value in maintaining this as this kind of pure assessment. Something like that in-class essay that you have 50 minutes to write, right? We say, no, we think for various reasons, this is really beneficial and valuable, so we want to protect it from tech.
Yeah, really fascinating. In switching over and
Yep.
transitioning, because what's interesting is you've had so many skill sets, and you talk about, for example, how media is changing with AI in the educational space.
Yeah, this is one of my like soapbox things that I could like give me half an hour on this thing. I see this really with a risk management lens. And some of this is relevant probably to businesses broadly, but I think especially to schools. And so two risks that I highlight for school leaders that are typically not on their radar as they do tabletop exercises and plan out like their risk management strategy. The first one is reputational risk, which is if you are a head of school and you have 30 seconds of you on YouTube or Instagram, I can grab your voice and clone it and make you say anything I want. And then I can essentially create a media firestorm around something you didn't even say.
Mhm.
And so this actually has happened to school leaders where they've gotten framed by someone in their community, like the FBI had to get involved. It's really like dark stuff. There are ways to mitigate against that we can borrow from the world of online misinformation, which has been studied for years. And what they've found is that it's much better to pre-bunk than to debunk. In other words, if you train your community ahead of time and let them know this technology exists, what you're essentially doing is vaccinating them to some degree against the spread of viral disinformation, because rather than spread it on thoughtlessly, they have that kind of gut check moment of saying, wait a second, I know there's this thing called 11 Labs where you can clone a voice, and this doesn't really sound like something the head would say, so I'm going to reserve judgment. You need people to do that to stem the spread. The second major risk that school leaders don't know about, and this gets into really dark territory, is that roughly 90% of all AI-generated images are non-consensual deepfake pornography, and a huge percentage of that is targeting underage girls. So this is thing like wildfire through schools. And it's basically teenage boys or boys in middle school taking images of their female classmates and undressing them using AI tools. This is like a form of sexual violence. There's some legislation working its way through the House, but right now it's just a patchwork of states that have done anything about this.
Oh, wow. Interesting. Yeah. Because we can debate the merits of social media in the educational. And then with AI, I see a lot of good, but it's interesting that you pointed out the net. We have around 8 minutes remaining. How do your studies at some of the top schools, Columbia, Stanford, human-centered AI programs? What are your views on like private school leadership, technology, ethics? I'm curious.
Yeah. So the question is just about, can you just maybe reframe that for me a little bit?
Yeah, studying at the top universities in their AI program, how does that translate to how you approach it in your work with private schools and technology?
Yeah. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. Because I think ultimately a lot of doing any kind of advanced grad work is about the network that it plugs you into, and then the kind of social proof that comes with it that allows you to even get your foot in the door with a new client or a prospective client, right? Like it just has that air of, hey, I'm not a crazy person off the street. Like I've been stamped by these institutions. That's not to say cynically that I'm not taking stuff from them. I think especially from the Columbia program, I'm taking a ton, but it's the same with anything. Like 90% of what you're going to learn on the ground, like actually doing the work in the schools and hearing. It's one thing to know it in the abstract or to read it in a book, but then to try to apply it, it ends up being a totally different set of challenges. I'd say there's a huge amount of benefit to doing grad work, especially for the networking, for the social proof, and for some of the content. But ultimately, like you're going to have to get your hands dirty and actually try to do it in the real world because that's where the rubber meets the road and where you actually, I think, learn the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really interesting. I'm also very curious how future trends in technology. We talked about AI, but there's a new wave coming, which is the metaverse. In
Mhm.
metaverse and just virtual rooms and just holograms. What emerging technologies besides AI do you believe will have a significant impact on education, particularly like metaverse and just these Facebook's coming out with the lens and holograms as well?
Yeah. So I'm going to be a little bit of a cynic and suggest that I'm sure there's like merit to all this, but I think with the metaverse and Web3 and with AI, I think a lot of what we're seeing is the fact that there's been a huge amount of money that's been invested in this stuff. They need to see some kind of payout from it. They've got these, in some cases, really overvalued stock prices that they're getting by. And it's not like Apple is coming out with something as great as what the iPhone was in like 2007 or whenever it was. So I think we're seeing, unfortunately, like a lot of a hype cycle and also a lot of AI snake oil. And where I think that meets up with what I do is that if you are a small school, an underfunded school, a department of one competing against a school across town that's got 5 people or 10 people working in your department, you're vulnerable to some of that snake oil because you're in a position of feeling like, oh my gosh, like this technology promises to replace your HR department. It can do all the hiring for you and review resumes and make these great decisions. It's not, the technology is not really there yet. And they're promising this stuff because to run these data centers is costing them tons of money. And so they're trying to figure out how to justify that and get a return on their investment. I have no doubt that VR and like all these things that they will, I'm sure, work their way into the classroom in really cool ways. But the problem is that the Elon Musks of the world, when they say, oh, AI is here, education solved, like, these people don't know anything about learning science or pedagogy. They've never set foot in a classroom. There isn't an AI. I'll give you just a quick example, which is if you're a teacher, if you've ever been an educator, like at least once a year, a kid is going to walk into your class clearly either crying or just having been crying. Like the classroom is a messy place. It is really messy. There's just never going to be an AI that knows what to do when a student comes in on the verge of tears because their girlfriend just broke up with them or whatever. Like
Mhm.
it's so relational, it's so human based. And so I'm
Yeah.
just very wary of a lot of the promises because anyone who's ever been on the ground in the classroom knows that it's just so freaking complicated and so human. Right.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. How can people find out more about you? And obviously, very passionate, very educated, and you got a lot of experience. So, how can people reach out to you and connect with you?
Yeah, no, so I'm on LinkedIn. I think I'm like slash Evan Harris AI, because of course I am. And then it's pathosgroup.ai is my consulting group. And we work predominantly with independent schools doing strategy, faculty and staff training, bringing in some ed tech tools we think are really exciting and trying to focus on this as like organizational development challenge. Like how do you move an entire organization from A to B, especially when it's a very emotionally charged issue, which AI is. Yeah, so pathosgroup.ai, like hit me up on LinkedIn. Yeah, I'd love to connect with anybody that's interested in like how what we do at schools or bringing us into a school would be great.
Yeah. I really love this area of AI and technology education. And I really enjoyed our conversation and keep up the great work.
Oh, thanks, Chris. Yeah, thanks for having me, man.